Alrighty, it's official. The U.S. has officially turned on Zelensky in the pages of the Washington Post, which is a mouthpiece of the deep state. They are squarely putting the blame for losing the war to Russia on. Maybe they didn't say just Zelensky, but they said the Ukrainian government. They said that it is Ukraine's fault, that they have been properly equipped, and that they are bungling the war. Specifically, the headline that I've seen most places, as it's being reported, is that the U.S. is disappointed that Ukraine is not being more aggressive, that Ukraine is not fighting Russia hard enough. It kind of reminds me of, if you were a Ukraine supporter, it's got to feel like that James Cameron quote where he says, the message of Avatar, his big budget blue people movie. The message that he wants people to take away from it is that the Native Americans should have fought harder to keep their land. Which is, it's just insane gaslighting. Because Ukraine is not capable. No matter how hard they fight, they're not going to beat Russia. We keep pumping in weapons and weapons and weapons. And yes, the Pentagon is saying this, behind the scenes. They're saying this off the record. Ukraine is plenty well equipped. They cry that they're not well equipped enough. We give them everything that we have. We've emptied our coffers, and Ukraine is still losing. And so at the end of the day, the Pentagon is saying that this is a tactical problem. This is Ukraine fighting a war using Soviet tactics, not NATO tactics. That they are not using, or I guess you would. I'm not a military guy, so excuse me if I misuse the terms tactics and strategies. I understand that, tactics are the small-time thing and strategy is the big picture stuff. I know at least that much, but beyond that, I know nothing about this stuff. But they're saying that the way that Ukraine is fighting the war is based on Soviet doctrine. And that's why they're losing, because, of course, the Soviets couldn't fight a war nearly as well as the Americans. It's funny. They found a way to blame Russia. Even when they're blaming Ukraine, they're saying, well, it's the problem is they're using Russian tactics. That's why they're losing. They're fighting too much like Russians. That's why Russia is winning, because Russia's tactics are so bad that it's making Ukraine lose. It's just funny. But no, they're saying that NATO doctrine, which is of course built on blitzkrieg, and in the West. Nazi blitzkrieg, was seen as the beginning of modern military warfare after World War II. Even though the Nazis lost, the West, particularly the U.S., tried to learn as much as they could from the German military officers, and sort of just built upon what they had developed. And their tactics, and that's what became how Western militaries operate. This was the story of the Arab-Israeli War. What was Israel's advantage? Why were they able to beat back all these big armies? It was seen. It was the religious Israelis say that, well, this was the hand of God, obviously, because Israel should have never won that war. But the secular explanation is that, well, the Israelis had blitzkrieg, and the Arabs were not engaging in that kind of warfare, and so they did not expect the Israelis to just, be so aggressive as the U.S. wants Ukraine to be, and break their lines. And so even though they had these, well fortified lines, and they had overwhelming manpower advantage, the Israelis were able to break through. But getting back to whether this is actually how Ukraine is operating, from what I understand, it's hard you're not going to get accurate numbers from either side. You would expect Russia to overestimate how many Ukrainians they're killing, and you would expect Ukraine to underestimate how many of their guys are actually being killed by Russia. But still, the impression that we've gotten from what we've been able to see, the anecdotes seem to support that, Bakhmut, for example, was quite the meat grinder. They were just throwing in untrained troops, this is what we're hearing, and they would get wiped out. So if that's not aggressive, I don't know what is. Taking guys who were untrained, pushing them into the front line, telling them, hey, go crazy, and letting them get wiped out. I think if you're doing that, you can't be more desperate in your charges. That is overwhelming aggression. If they were showing restraint, you would think, hey, let's hold back, let's try to preserve these troops, let's get them better trained, and then maybe very slowly we try and progress, let's try and conserve our manpower. We don't want to expose our troops to enemy fire unless we absolutely have to. This is what the U.S. is accusing Ukraine of, being overly cautious. But I don't think that's the case. I think the Ukraine has been very aggressive in this so-called counteroffensive. They have not been rewarded with successful results, and again, the U.S. blames the failure of the counteroffensive on a lack of aggression. They're saying you're just not fighting hard enough. Whereas everything else I've seen throughout this war, it seems to indicate that Ukraine is fighting very hard and losing. So to me, this seems very clearly to be an opportunity to save face. It's the U.S. trying to turn the tide on the narrative. They're trying to backtrack and extract themselves from this situation so that ultimately, in the end, when they pull out, when they pull their support and Ukraine collapses, they have a narrative already built in, that's already been circulating in the media that says, hey, it wasn't our fault. We at the Pentagon did our job. We funneled all of these arms to Ukraine in vain because Ukraine was not able to properly utilize them. Now, meanwhile, while Ukraine is being very conservative and not wanting to be too aggressive against Russia, they blew up the Kerch Strait Bridge, the bridge connecting mainland Russia to Crimea. Obviously, this is a very important choke point for transportation within Russia because you have who knows how many civilians cross that bridge every day, going from Crimea to mainland Russia. These people who are in Crimea are Russian citizens now, and so therefore they want to have access to the rest of Russia by car. And for that crime of wanting to travel to the rest of Russia, the people of Crimea were greeted with bombs, which is not the first time. It's not the first time even that they blew up the Kerch Strait Bridge. But before they blew up the railroad portion, now they blew up the part where all the civilians are just driving their cars. And we saw on Sunday night, grotesque images of dead people in their cars, people who wrecked because there was a bomb that detonated right in front of them. And of course, traffic was stopped. But the traffic jam is the minor part. The major thing here is that Ukraine blew up a bridge while people were driving across it, and a bunch of people died. I don't know how many people died. I should go double check that, but that wasn't my focus for today. But my point here is to say, Ukraine, we're told by the U.S., the U.S. claims that it was not Americans who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. We're told it was Ukrainians that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. Let's just take that for granted. I don't believe that, but let's take the U.S. at their word, because I'm trying to be consistent with them. The U.S. says Ukraine blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. We know Ukraine blew up the Kerch Strait Bridge twice, including blowing up the civilian parts, where they're just innocent people driving. People who, were Ukrainian citizens just a few years ago. And then they blew up the dam, what was it, the Kakhovka Dam or something, which they don't admit to, but they probably will soon. All of these are examples, we're told, of Ukraine not being aggressive enough. Now, maybe the U.S. means, okay, we don't mean aggressive as in blowing up infrastructure, we mean aggressive as in they should just be blowing up Russia. They should be charging in to trying to break through Russian lines and reclaiming territory. Okay. To that extent, that is beyond my level of expertise. And so we can somewhat take them at their word, but it's kind of strange that the first we're hearing of it. Especially after all the stuff where Zelensky was given the cold shoulder at the NATO summit in Vilnius. It kind of seems like this is just a continuation of that, and that now the West is trying to distance themselves from the failures of Ukraine. They're hanging Zelensky out to dry, when for this whole time, he really was just sort of acting as their surrogate in Kiev. It's why he didn't go forward with the peace deal back in, March or April? I think it was March of 2022. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.